This is Our Planet Radio.
We're here with Dr. David Martin, who is a business founder, public policy advisor, and communicator. He's done a lot of work on pioneering unstructured data analysis and linguistic genomics. His work led to predictions of the 2008 collapse. He is the founder of MCAM, which is an international corporation that specializes in analyzing intellectual properties and intangible assets. And he's here with me today to talk about his appearance at the Global Breakthrough Energy Movement Conference in Hiversum, Holland, a few weeks ago. And David, I wanted to get you on to talk about maybe a number of things, but most importantly right now, the global energy situation, analyzing that, understanding it, what happened at Hiversum, and what the potential future is for being able to finally break through the ceiling to get to new forms of energy that are both environmentally and economically more feasible than what we have now. So your takeaway from the conference.
Randy, the conference that the Global BEM organized was actually a truly spectacular assembly of a number of different groups of people. And it was something worth noting that the organizers did a phenomenal job of bringing together both technical experts in the area of alternative energies, a lot of people with a variety of social and spiritual and cultural areas of expertise, and then a rather diverse array of generally interested parties to really have a multi-strategy, multidisciplinary conversation around not only alternative energies, but all of the social issues, all the economic issues, all the political issues that are part of considering alternative futures. And so I really give the organizers an enormous amount of credit for what they built. But in terms of the takeaways, it is important to realize that virtually all of the technology that was described and discussed during the 3-day sessions were, in fact, technologies that we've known about for quite a long time. Mm-hmm. At a rather interesting inflection in the conference, I think it started dawning on a number of people that we're talking about technology that harnesses energy that has been part of the human experience really since the beginning of the human experience. Things like
absolutely, yeah.
Things like magnetism, things like gravity, things like cosmic energies of all forms. And so the challenge that an enormous number of the participants have, and I think, quite frankly, the challenge we all have, is to understand that we are not empirically validating a principle of inertia or a principle of gravity or a principle of various forms of energy that find themselves kind of ubiquitous in the broader cosmos. What we are struggling with at the moment is how to navigate a very important balance. On the one hand, we have this impulse that says that we have to make every energy turn into the 60 hertz electrical signal that is pumping through the high tension wires that litter our landscape, that have to show up in forms that can be plugged into a wall socket in our homes, rather than really addressing the more fundamental question, which is, how do we harness energy in a way that really is at human scale? When you realize that the current infrastructure that we have is so horrifically out of human scale, from our Promethean impulse to burn fossil fuels to our obsession with 60 hertz and everything having to plug itself into a wall, where we take alternating current and turn it into direct current so that we can run, generators to compress things and to animate things. The impulse that says that the last time we considered how we consume energy was when Edison and Westinghouse were fighting over who had the who had the upper hand is truly ludicrous. And really, I think one of the great things that happened at the conference was that conversation was started. And I think an enormous number of people woke up to the fact that there's a much deeper conversation to have. It's not about alternative energy. It's about alternative worldviews and how we see how we consume energy and power.
That particular conversation was very much anticipated, I think, by a number of people that I talked to prior to the conference. But what you just mapped out here, David, is really a paradigm shift in terms of how we conceptualize energy. Rather, we've looked at energy and we've looked at it from a hardware standpoint. I think almost all of the inventions that have been suppressed, the ones that where, people have disappeared or the patents have disappeared, have all been oriented around what you just said. And it was a concept I hadn't really considered before. The idea of plugging into the 60 hertz system, the high tension wire systems that span our country in the U.S. and across Europe as well. We are redefining what energy really is from a more, I guess, macro standpoint. Is that correct?
Yeah, so if you think about the illogic of the following, we currently pump oil out of the ground, we burn it, we have the steam that comes from the burning of that oil run turbines. Those turbines spin, and they spin against coiled copper, which generates the ability to harvest a current off of that spinning mass around coiled copper. And then we push that spinning mass through a series of inverters and capacitors and so forth, and we get it amped up to a place where it can actually get pushed across the grid. And then we do something really bizarre, which is we take all of that energy off the grid and we take it down into these little lines that go into our homes, and then we plug these very bizarre appliances into the wall so that we can, are you ready for this, spin another copper coil so that it compresses a gas so that it actually cools the refrigerator so that we can have a cold Coke. That's a really broken system. It's a broken system because we consume insane quantities of materials. You'll note that the copper intravenous mechanism is how we pump it through our system, which is the reason why huge mining conglomerates around the world have such a stranglehold on the commodity of copper. And we wonder why it is that these organizations that mine copper and produce oil have so much power, but every time we go to the refrigerator, we don't think for a moment that what we really wanted to do was compress a gas. We never asked whether running the current power grid is the best way to compress a gas. And we didn't even ask whether there was a different way to get a thermal gradient that maybe was a thermal gradient that didn't require any of that material, that could be used inside of people's homes at little to no resource cost. We didn't even think about that. And so the absence of consciousness has led us into this belief system that says that we have to have an appliance at the end of every outlet. And that paradigm is the reason why we have this ongoing madness, which is both the Promethean burning impulse as well as our addiction to copper.
When you talk about we haven't known, decisions were made a century ago, David. Certainly going into the 20th century, as different innovators and developers began their exploration of what would become a central power grid. We had the work of Nikola Tesla on one hand, and Tesla was using a technology which put electrical power through the air, a DC current that didn't require high amperage. But the powers that are shifted towards the Edison Westinghouse model for a reason, and that reason was because Tesla's model wouldn't have a meter on the end of it. That's probably the simplest way to understand this, is there was a decision made to put meters on the end of the electrical power grid for purposes of economically exploiting and controlling the same power grid. Would you agree with that?
Well, there's no question that by turning the power grid not only into the metered utility that it is, but more importantly, by making the grid something which became ubiquitous as part of the long-duration infrastructure bonds, which were used to create everything from things like the Tennessee Valley Authority, which harnessed an enormous amount of hydroelectric power, to the enormous amount of sovereign and quasi-sovereign fixed income bonds that finance everything from power to power distribution, power sourcing, the actual grid itself, where now every pensioner, every fiduciary who has any fixed income obligation not only is using their own power consumption at the public utility level, but we've actually made the grid itself part of the fabric of our fiduciary long-duration asset management from the standpoint of pensions and investments. And so we actually have built the addiction at so many layers that by trying to address this broader question, most of the people who are looking at alternative energy don't understand how deeply woven the tapestry of the grid actually is, and how much of the financial system that we currently operate in is fully dependent on its persistence. And so they underestimate the incumbent interest that says that the grid and all of the things attached thereto must be held sacrosanct, because clearly the idea that we would actually have distributed energy in a way that is neither metered nor constrained with respect to long-duration fixed income assets would suggest that we would have to change an enormous amount of a system that, quite frankly, the public doesn't even consider.
I don't think most people, the average person, has the economic grasp to understand how interdependent the whole system is, David, in terms of what you just talked about. That on a cellular level right now, your average retiree, for instance, they're not only burning electrical power, they're burning their own money, which is a form of energy as well. Is that kind of a simplified way of understanding that?
No question. And one of the points that I made during the presentation I made during the Global BEM conference in Hiversum was, it is time that we all understand that until we are willing to really step away from the participation at every level and then make conscious decisions about what we're willing to accept and what we're willing to challenge, we really can't have a credible conversation about alternative energy if we don't have a credible conversation about the social fabric of our economic structure.
You really redefined things in another way, even to the people that were there, and it had to do with financing. And I'm going to read the quote from your article, which was Bribes at the Supreme Court for Thermodynamics. You wrote, "Incredible is the insistence that with adequate financing, do we recall that money is distributed by private institutions for the benefit of their shareholders, we would be able to unleash alternative energy that would economically harm the shareholders that actually mint the thing that we need to destroy them." I know there's a lot of people inside the alternative energy movement who are very anti-establishment, and not without good cause, I might add. But one of the questions that I think I posed when I asked you to come on for the interview was, how do we deal with an economic system where we require their capital in order to build a system which would effectively obsolete their monetary system?
Yeah, Randy, if you and I spent the next 10 hours on one topic and could move the needle of public discourse 1 degree on this topic, it would be time well spent. Because the fact is that we turn to the incumbent controlling system and say, give us the utility of your money so that we can obsolete you. And we don't pay any attention to the Stockholm Syndrome nature of the fact that we are turning to the very abuser that we try to supplant and then ask that abuser to be a co-conspirator in their own demise. That energy is fundamentally flawed and quite literally a pathology from which we as a species have to be able to migrate away from, because it is what's killing not only alternative energy, but it's killing alternative medicine, it's killing all kinds of alternative structures. But the core of this, Randy, is actually quite simple. If we understand that the way we start this process of rendering visible true alternatives actually has to start not with consumer economic denominated transactions, but it has to start with a group of people who are committed to manifesting that thing which wants to be born without any involvement of the consensus financial institutions. By doing that, what you invite is the transition of capital rather than the supplanting of it. And I will tell you that if you look at the number of people who have decided that alternative energy has to be fundamentally anti-establishment, I think two things are missed. First is that anytime we participate with capital, regardless of the nature of that participation, every participation we have is part of the incumbent system and therefore subject to that system's controls. And it is not until we free ourselves from that first impulse that says, I have to fund using the incumbent monetary system, until we free ourselves from that, we are stuck in a paradigm that ultimately will be asking for the abuser to actually fund the very infrastructure that will end the abuse. And that obviously is a ludicrous proposition because it will never actually unfold.
The history of alternative energy is littered with people who have wound up bankrupted, in some cases dead, having their patents bought, stolen, exploited, and buried, and basically watching their own hardware, software inventions go down the tubes, in some cases a lifetime of work, because of the strangulation of the oxygen of capital. When we look at capital, we define it in terms of the present economic system because that's the only model we have, David. So what, in your estimation, would be the beginning point for us to approach a new concept of working capital from a different vantage?
Well, I think that there's an interesting step that alternative energy and alternative medicine and alternative a lot of things need to take. And the first step is to recognize that the power of transformation comes through the power of invitation, not from the power of conflict. And what I mean by that is that when we have the ability to show that there are ample opportunities for alternatives to be manifest at scale. And I'll give you a wonderful example. We work with a group in Nepal, and the group is called the Kevin Rohan Memorial Foundation, and it is an eco-village outside of Kathmandu, run by just a luminary being who is just literally on the absolute cutting edge of human thought and human action. And what Krishna has done with the Kevin Rohan Memorial Eco Foundation is he has actually taken on the job of manifesting first and inviting capital to participate, not as an arbiter of his success, but as a participating utility in his success. And Randy, that's the real shift. It's not a choice against capital. It's actually a choice against allowing capital to arbitrate whether something lives or dies. And that's the piece that I am so passionate about, because we're not in a situation where we are precluded from doing alternative things. And quite frankly, we're not in a position of being precluded from using money as a transitive value-storing utility. There's nothing intrinsically wrong with that. What's wrong is when we essentially subordinate our creative impulse to letting monetary presence or absence dictate whether we move or we don't move. And I will tell you that one of the great challenges that I confront time and time again in this ecosystem as well as several others is the number of people who are convinced that the monetary system is their enemy. And in fact, what they've done is they've actually railed against a utility that's kind of not the point. The point is not to confront money and confront the evil that people associate with money in a way that actually antagonizes that energy. It's actually quite to the contrary. An invitation to say, I'm going to move forward. I'm going to manifest the thing that I know is needed at this time in humanity. And at the appropriate time, I will even invite monetary participation. But I will live above the ability to have money be the arbiter of my success or failure. You talked about bankruptcy. You talked about capital constraints and controls. Remember that every patent that's been filed has used a proprietary system, which is a proprietary system controlled by an establishment. It is not something, by the way, that can be controlled if you don't use the system. And one of the things that we've done to prove that is through the Global Innovation Commons, which is a platform that MCAM developed several years ago. We've actually taken all of those intellectual properties that have been protected and taken and stolen and buried and everything else, and we've put them out in front of the world to take $2 trillion worth of R&D, $2 trillion worth of technologies, and emancipate those innovations by letting the world see where they can be used for free. And today there's over 250,000 people around the globe who are using the technology that we've said has been buried, and they're using it at scale in their communities in Africa and in Pakistan and in Bangladesh, all over Asia, all over South America. And the fact is that these things breathe when we don't let money be the first arbiter of success and implementation.
Well, you bring up the patent situation, David. Is the patent process itself inherently broken at this point? I'll follow that up by saying I've been involved with the software industry and software development for about 20 years on and off, and I followed eagerly the open source models that have been deployed. And I'm wondering, are we served by a patent system that seems rooted back in the mid-1800s, or is there a better paradigm to get intellectual property into the marketplace, protect the rights of the property owners, and at the same time serve the public interest in a system that is not so cloistered in old mindsets?
Yeah, well, that's a great question. And Randy, you know I'm deeply passionate about that. The idea of intellectual property itself, the idea of a patent, is in fact a idea that Thomas Jefferson himself said was an affront to the free market, which I think is very funny. That we actually are using a system that one of our greatest philosopher, thinker, leaders of certainly the American history of this iteration of humanity actually said was an affront to free markets. But if we think about what the patent system is, the patent at a core is the right to constrain a cash flow. That's really what it is. It's the ability to control a price on a thing to keep it from becoming a commodity. And the right to do that is quite cumbersome in the form of a patent, because not only do you have to have the ability to gain the right of that control, but you have to have venues of enforcement which are of equal access. And you know as well as I do that courts, and particularly litigation around intellectual property, is a rich corporation's game. It is not the small guy's game. So we could do one of two things. We could actually go ahead and file patents and then watch them get buried and bought and abused. Or we can do what the open source software movement did and come up with things like general purpose licenses. Or we can do what we've done at MCAM, which is adopt a version of an end user license agreement that actually controls market participation through contract rather than through property right. We are extremely proactive advocates for contract law rather than property law, simply because there is a more appropriate human scale to saying that willing buyers, willing sellers, willing contributors, willing consumers all can live inside of the walls of contract much more cleanly than we can with a property system that you quite correctly identify as a legacy of the 18th century, which really hasn't adjusted to be relevant in our time, and certainly has not been adjusted from the standpoint of accessibility to be a genuine venue for people to actually have the ability to benefit from the inventions that they make. So we think that contract law is the way to go, not intellectual property, because there are simply more opportunities for more people to engage in that format than the current intellectual property framework.
In contract law, and if we go into some distinctions here, in contract law, we're talking about an agreement between two or more private consenting participants. And in that scheme, what is the final enforcement of values between the parties if there's a breach?
Well, that's where, if you think about it from the standpoint of a developer of software under the general purpose license, for example, in the open source software community or in the free software community, those situations are situations where the significant controls are in the ability to decompile, delicense, or in fact directly take remediating steps to cease and desist an activity that is contrary to the contract. So it's the termination of various utilization rights, it's the termination of various functionalities. It is the ability to go in and restrict or limit the sale or reuse of certain technologies outside of their licensed use. And ultimately, there are more remedies available under contract provisions than there ever will be under property provisions, because property right as an intellectual property framework has an extremely high barrier procedurally to enforcement, and it has even a higher barrier with respect to venue when it comes to technologies, specifically when you think about alternative energy technologies, because as I pointed out in the blog post you referenced, it is alternative energy which enjoys the rather dubious distinction of being the only thing that the United States Patent Office has, by statute, precluded from being something that is patentable subject matter. So you can't get a fair hearing when somebody, quote, doesn't believe in gravity, end quote.
And people, I will post links with this interview as well, because people need to read and grasp what you're really talking about in that. In terms of the present state of intellectual property rights, for instance, we have this ridiculous series of lawsuits with Apple and Samsung and Apple and HTC over patents that, when you go back through the patents themselves, and anybody who has a background in the tech field knows the history a little bit, will tell you that most of Apple's patents were derivative from the Xerox Palo Alto Research Center work that was done and deployed by Apple back in the late 70s and early 80s. So we have patent infringement lawsuits over derivative intellectual properties that have simply been patented. I'm aware of courts that do nothing now but adjudicate derivative patent lawsuits on a daily basis. So we have this system where we do not even have a well-defined definition of intellectual property anymore.
Well, it's very fascinating. The United States Patent Office, which unfortunately most citizens of the United States and quite frankly most citizens of the world hold up an illusion which absolutely is not true. The United States Patent Office is actually a fee-based organization that gets paid, and listen very carefully, it gets paid for the issuance of patents. It gets paid an application fee, but it also gets paid what's called maintenance fees. And when the Patent Office, back in 1999 and 2000, was actually being held up for scrutiny by the Congress, actually looking at the extremely horrific quality statistics that were coming out, which showed that by just having a second examiner look at patents, in some particular technology areas, the allowance rate was cut in half or even worse, sometimes as much as 80%, just by getting a second opinion. But the Patent Office rejected actually instituting quality reviews of a independent or second set of eyes nature because it was, quote, bad for business. What that meant was that they were finding out that to keep their budget, they needed to continually issue patents regardless of their quality. The former head of patent quality, Esther Keplinger, at the Patent Office, made the public statement that it was not the Patent Office's job to determine whether there was commercial relevance for a patent and whether or not the patent determination was ultimately going to be pro-business or actually going to run against the interests of free and fair competition and true innovation. Her business model and the business model of the Patent Office itself was to issue as many patents as possible and then let the courts figure out what should or shouldn't have been issued. The problem with that is that in a court, the actual facts surrounding a patent are also not considered. And the reason, Randy, is very simple. Let's say you're Apple and you're Samsung and you're suing each other. There's a thing called prior art, which is the evidence that's evidenced by a third party that says you didn't invent the thing that you're claiming to have invented. But the problem is that if you are the plaintiff suing a defendant, the defendant is unlikely to use all of the prior art that would be relevant to unwind your patent, because by introducing evidence of invalidity, the evidence would also be used against the defendant's own portfolio. So if you look at Apple and Samsung, the reason why these cases are being litigated is because neither party can actually let independent facts stand on their own. They have to actually mask the true independent facts, because if Samsung challenged the validity of Apple's patents, or if Apple challenged the validity of Samsung's patents, the evidence that they would use to invalidate each other's patents would ultimately turn on their own. And because of that, there is an agreement, a consensus of this conspiracy of silence that says that it's better to litigate in ignorance than to settle this stuff in actual transparency and an unqualified review of enforceability. And that's a problem created by the Patent Office failing to actually control itself, and then a system in which the ability for independent arbitration to actually only allow for the enforcement of legitimate patents has entirely not been present, and ultimately is harming the customer, it's harming the ecosystem, it's harming innovation, it's building an enormous barrier to true invention, and it's ultimately serving no value except to the parties who are involved in the litigation and the service providers who feed at that trough.
And one of the aspects of this that I don't think most consumers understand, we're talking lawsuits here that have billions and billions of dollars standing on the line, is that at the end of the day, the losing party is not going to ultimately take the hit. Their stocks may drop, their valuations may drop, but the cost is passed on to the consumer, as it always is by corporations. I think that's an important distinction that people don't understand.
Every time you buy an Android phone or an iPhone or a HTC phone, you are paying for the legal wranglings of the party you didn't purchase from. And if you don't think that that constitutes an antitrust and a collusion violation, you're not paying attention to either one of them.
Yes, absolutely. That brings it all up. It goes back to an old Warren Buffett statement that I used to carry around. It said, corporations don't pay taxes, they collect them. And I think that's important for people to understand how everything's funded out of the public pocket.
Well, and in the case of the Apple-Samsung situation, Randy, as you know, I've made a number of public statements on the Apple-Samsung litigation, and I will tell you that there is no winner in this except the attorneys, because at the end of the day, every one of the costs, however this ultimately shakes out, every one of the costs is passed along to the consumer in higher prices. Nothing about this is creating fundamentally new innovation, which is helping the living experience of the customer. It is merely a way to tax the customer at a higher rate and set prices in an illegal and non-transparent way.
So given the failure, the structure that we have with the tech industry, which, from the late 1970s through what I call the golden decade, the late 1980s, it was the shining hope of America, certainly in the world. And then it all fell apart, and it fell apart with the dot-com bubble that burst, which was speculative in nature. But also it was falling apart under the weight of its own patent asset assessments. Numerous lawsuits between Apple and Microsoft and all these different developers of technology. Having kind of nutshelled it that way, how do we take this global breakthrough energy movement now with the energy that's been impelled into it by the people at BEM and by this movement worldwide that desires to break off of the grid? How do we learn lessons from that? How do we develop a structure and a strategy where we don't replicate these mistakes and where we begin to innovate not only the structures of technology, but also the structures of finance and law as well? I know you at MCAM really do have a structure in place that would facilitate all of this. How do you envision this being applied, David?
Yeah, well, I think there are a couple core elements. The first is that across the entirety of the economic infrastructure, we need to reintegrate productivity with value exchange at its core. And what that means is that we need to understand that the incentives that we create and reward need to be aligned with what we refer to in our organization as a fully integral accounting view of the world. What that means is that we need to celebrate as much value creation as possible with as few possible limitations on resources, on utilities, on extractive and destructive components as possible. And let me unpack that a little bit.
Yes, please.
I use a term that I've been promoting quite a bit lately, which is the kind of the new definition of wealth. And wealth is equal to the value of a utility times the retained options that you leave for others across as many dimensions as possible. And ultimately, what we are doing is we're trying to look at a situation and say, understand in every human impulse what it is that we actually need. And then how do we get to what we need through a path that consumes the least and achieves the most optionality for others to equally benefit. If I'm burning oil, for example, I'm actually removing the option of that oil ever becoming plastic. Now that's a crude analogy, but it's an important analogy. If I take away that option and I say it's time to burn this thing, I have actually had a finality in my resource utilization curve. If, however, I take oil and I take it through a number of processes and get multiple uses out of it, and ultimately I then burn it at the end, I'm still achieving a more desirable outcome because I'm introducing more utility extractions between point A and point B. Inside of MCAM, we have a financing structure that we refer to as sovereign technology credit obligations. And what that sovereign technology credit obligation framework does is it allows us to look at all utilities and all artifacts, all things that are created, and looks at the optimal way You bring resources into the equation, and the optimal way that those resources can be maximally and beneficially used. And what we find in the sovereign technology credit obligation framework is that we fundamentally link all forms of monetary and economic exchange to the highest reward going to those enterprises that maintain the highest optionality for the longest duration of time, meaning that we're not consuming, we're not destroying, we're not burning, we're not removing all of the options at the front. We're making sure that we're getting as much use out of everything as possible, and in many instances, actually finding out that when we bring that level of consciousness to a process, we find out we actually don't need what we thought we needed in the first place, and an enormous number of, quote, demanded needs or absolute needs actually fall away, and we need less.
So you basically now bring it into the scale of human decision-making predicated on ethical values rather than simply the utility of the thing itself.
You know, the amazing thing, Randy, is that we were asked to envision this sovereign technology credit obligation many years ago with the Singaporean government. And it turns out that by looking at maximum resource alignment and utilization using what we call our phase and state coherence models, it actually generated a better economic return measured in dollars and cents too. It was actually phenomenal to see that when you become more conscious about how you understand a thing and how you understand your interaction with a thing, you wind up using it in a way that both extracts less in terms of destructive value and aligns more in terms of productive utility. And it turns out that even from the standpoint of a more pure economic metric, you actually do better by doing well.
We've literally adopted a scorched earth policy in terms of resources. I remember in the first interview you and I did together, David, and I've used this example to try and explain some of your concepts to people. We talked about standing forest of trees and the utility value of that as the perception being board feet of lumber, but in fact those trees may be evaluated on a better scale as oxygen producing units.
Correct.
And so when we're looking at going towards this new energy movement, let's take the hypothetical inventor who has a process, who has a particular breakthrough that would enable us to have localized power generation, a box in our house, something like that. And this inventor comes to you, but he has a problem. He has a lack of capital. He has no way to develop this because of the perceived threat to the utility companies and to the grid at large. Where do you take somebody in retransitioning their mindset and working with them in how they're going to move forward with their innovation?
Yeah, beautiful question. And the way we look at it is to kind of take a step back in as little judgment as possible and say, if you, let's say for the sake of argument that you have a Coriolis force harvesting device where you're harvesting that wonderful ubiquitous phenomenon of water spinning down a drain. Mm-hmm. And you figure out a way to harvest that energy with a very high degree of efficiency. The way you get that to scale is not trying to get it to create enough power to run a 10 volt or a 50 volt or a 100 volt or a 200 volt generator, but rather you go to the appliance engineering firms, you go to the universities that have really cool, whether it's engineering or biomedical engineering or consumer electronics engineering firms. You sit down with people who are willing to think outside the box and say, let's create a system in which the amount of energy we're harvesting from a Coriolis generator actually is the right amount for something. Maybe it's the trickle charge for your phone, or maybe it's a mechanical device that you need to use that stays mechanical. You never turn it into electricity. You turn it into something that merely harvests the mechanical energy. What we do, Randy, is we align the actual scale at scale. So if it's a Coriolis generation harvester, we actually look at the degree to which the energy that can be harvested there can be harnessed and directly applied as the mechanical energy it is, rather than trying to conform it into electricity and thereby limit the amount of things that we can do with it. And it turns out that when you do that, you find out that there are an enormous number of appliances that we've never considered. There are an enormous number of things we've never considered because we're so addicted to the outlet. What we do is we take the energy at scale and link it directly to the utilization at scale. And by linking those two things, I cut out the middleman, which is called the power conversion inverter. I don't have to deal, in most instances, by taking that energy and making it ubiquitous through the electrical appliance. And the way that thing gets funded then is to build micro industries, and for that matter, even macro industries, around alternative energy appliances that can be brought to scale. I'm going to take you back to Nepal to prove out exactly this point. With Krishna Gurung's initiative with the Kevin Rohan Memorial Ecological Foundation, one of the things that they're doing is they're doing an enormous amount of work in biogas, because it turns out that in a primarily Hindu culture, the amount of cow dung is actually rather remarkable. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. By consolidating that cow dung, they had the opportunity to turn that into a little power generation set, which would essentially power the community with a little generator by burning the methane that comes off of their biodigesters. But it turns out that what people really wanted was they actually really wanted the gas for cooking. They actually didn't need electricity. And by staying inside the gas as gas and using the gas as gas, they wound up having a much more productive utility than by trying to generate electricity, distributing that electricity, and ultimately losing the majority of energy in the power conversion cycle. By keeping the power uniquely distributed to the place where it was needed, what you found was gas lanterns were viable, gas stoves were viable, all kinds of other things were viable, and at no point did you need to turn it into electricity. That psychology, which works in Kathmandu, Nepal, works in Charlottesville and works in Camp Hill, Pennsylvania.
That completely flips the paradigm. If you look at the freak out of this so-called superstorm that hit us here on the East Coast a few weeks ago, and I know because I was in the path of it, it hit here, but what it did in effect was it threatened the power grid of the Northeast United States, and with that, it left people who are now trapped in this energy grid with nearly no way to cope with anything. I mean, my gosh, even the mobile phone systems ultimately failed in New Jersey and out on Long Island, New York, because of the fact that these small, tiny systems of survival are not self-contained, which I think is what you're talking about.
Exactly. We have thousands of people across New York and Long Island and even into New Jersey who are huddling around highly inefficient, highly unviable heating sources as winter sets in, who still do not have any electricity in their homes weeks after the storm. And we, for all intents and purposes, are one superstorm away from the Stone Age, because we've put ourselves at the mercy of a single power currency. And what we need to do, and what we are doing in a lot of the communities that we work with around the world, is we're saying, rather than go down the pathway of building the same incumbent addictions, just never put the grid in place. Start with a system that actually understands what I keep referring to as phase and state coherence. Keep the energy as close to the form that it comes in. Keep the state of matter as close to the form it comes in. Find out how to use it with maximum effect and with maximum optionality preserved. And when you do that, you find out that it's better on all metrics, including economics.
Can we now extrapolate that same example outward a little bit and apply it to economic systems, microeconomic systems, because I actually see that that's kind of where this all goes anyway, David?
Well, there's no question, Randy, that as we think about where the future economic system is going, we realize that too big to fail at the currency level and at the central bank level is actually failing. So the cool thing is that we know that by creating these gargantuan structures and by building so much dependency on those gargantuan structures that they are seen as the utility with which must be preserved at all costs, what we're seeing is that riots across Europe, riots across various parts of the economically challenged parts of the United States, riots across parts of Asia, labor unrest, civil and actual military strife. These are all things which are a direct consequence of a monolithic structure which is no longer serving the purpose that even its promoters and founders thought it would serve. Remember that in the WTO, we are now sitting years after the failed Doha round of negotiations, and we are now still debating whether or not we can actually close what is now nearly a decade of acrimony around trade, around subsidy, around all of these monolithic structures. We know that the system doesn't work at this scale, and we know that what does work, and what is important to recognize, is historically we have ample evidence that says that trade networks, not currency exchanges, but trade networks, whether those be at the micro scale or at the macro scale, are the most sustainable form of economic growth and wealth creation that has ever hit the planet. We have had a 100-year experiment. We are about to celebrate the 100th year in the United States. We've had a 100-year experiment with a system that has shown itself not to be resilient and robust. And it's time for us to accept the fact that there are things to learn from that experiment, but one of the key takeaways is to not reproduce what we know fails.
And it is failing. And that's the part of it that I think a lot of people that I talk to right now are not terrified by, but in fact are going, this is an opportunity. You put a Twitter post out where you pointed to a story that was posted on CNBC, Smart Money, hedge funds now worse than mutual funds. And you kind of said, hey, ask me about this, so I'm going to ask you about it. Is this an indicator that their best possible system right now is failing them?
There's no question. And Randy, we've done a extensive study on the actual performance of managers of money. And if you would like, I'd be happy to share the substance of that research with you, and we could distribute it on your website.
Yeah, I'd like that very much. I think.
But what we've done is we've looked at the actual historical performance of fiduciary managers and shown that not only do they fail to perform under their fiduciary obligations at the level that they promote, but worse than that, they actually take wealth and place it into what I call kind of corralled resource pools, from which high frequency and low latency traders actually harvest significant amounts of capital by knowing how constrained the capital flows are. Essentially by knowing the size of the pipe, if you will, through which various amounts of money flow. Systems, these are all algorithm-based systems, can actually harvest a frictional tariff, if you will, for all of the value that flows through each pipe. And it turns out that fiduciary managers have not only underperformed, but they've literally placed their assets and the assets that they have been given fiduciary responsibility to manage into harm's way by putting them into products which are in fact scraped by algorithms to take any investment yield off the top and leave the investor with little or no return. And we've been able to show that with a very, very high degree of accuracy, understanding where the dynamics are. And what it really augurs for is that it is time for every person who actually has any eye towards resource stewardship, whether that be financial or otherwise, to take a much more active role in understanding the actual exposures that they have, the actual positions that they're exposed to, and understand that it is their duty, their responsibility, to be informed as to how currency, value, and resource flows inside of the things that they animate with their money and with their time and effort. And that's something that has to be part of everybody's consciousness, because it simply has been too long neglected, and it has been neglected at great cost.
When we talk about money, we talk about a currency system, and the human mind has a very short retention of history. Going back to, as you mentioned, we're coming up on 100 years here because of the establishment of the Federal Reserve. I've had an intelligence insider tell me that the net effect of World War I was the public letting of money. In other words, money was at one time a private resource, but it became public property after World War I, which is sort of evidenced if you follow the trends. With World War II and what happened with Bretton Woods, we saw another level of what became currency, which was global monetization and this rampant trend towards derivatives and interest-based profit-taking. So this system has in levels kind of streamed towards this megalith that now sits on top of us as an economic system. Capital itself is predicated on hard assets of money, but is there an alternative system where the average person can begin to move? I have people asking me, where do we move our money? What do we do? Where do we invest? The stock market's flat. It's not performing. I know people who are investors who are looking right now to earnestly invest money and seem to have no place to go with it.
Well, that's where my constant refrain is a message of absolute hope. There is a world filled with opportunities. There are communities, whether they be in your local community or whether they be around the world, where people are really breaking out of the incumbent systems. And one of the reasons why I celebrate the time we spend together, Randy, is because there is no question that by expanding this dialogue and exposing your listeners to the opportunities that are existing around the world, there are ample places to engage where you know that not only you're making a difference and you're generating a positive return, but more importantly, you're getting reattached to the humanity that we've all been so long missing. And there is an enormous opportunity to step back in to private, opportunistic development of value and wealth. And that's where investors need to go, because the consensus illusion is over.
One final follow-up, David, because I wanted to try to keep this interview within an hour. Obviously, you're traveling right now. You're in Paris, France, and you're on a I guess you've been on a travel for quite a while now, haven't you?
Indeed, yes.
Yeah. But one of the things that caught my attention this morning in scanning through different feeds was this headline, Obama begins to push for new national retirement system. Effectively, what he's proposing to do now is what he has successfully done in his first term with the healthcare system, which would be a nationalization of what has been a quasi-private retirement investment system. And it seems to me like, first off, This is not the way that anybody would want to go. I don't think nationalizing healthcare was the way to go as well. But more importantly, what Mr. Obama is doing in one sense is, I believe, what you pointed to in your book, The Apostles of Greed. We're in the fourth stage of what is outlined in that book, aren't we, David?
We are indeed, and I'm glad you brought it up. If you would have said a year and a half ago that I would have called in writing the fact that the path tunnels in New Jersey would flood on the week of the election, I think anybody would have said that would have been a far reach. But the fact is that we are in the fourth stage of the book. That your viewers and your listeners should really pay attention to this, because what's happening is now a migration away from the fiduciary obligations that are part of the legacy of pension law that goes back to the 1970s under the ERISA laws and modernizations of the ERISA laws. And it is absolutely imperative that people understand that the grand bargain that was the inducement to participate in the national pension racket, which was this idea of tax deferral, is now going to come back and bite everyone in the tail. And the idea that somehow or another not paying taxes on your salary today is worth the tax burden that you'll pay down the road was an illusion when it was created, and it's an illusion now. And the sooner you bite the bullet and pay your tax and then move on, the better you are, because waiting for what is going to be the next round of pension reform is going to be a piece of medicine that no Affordable Health Care Act can take care of.
I would just follow that up, David, with asking, are we beyond the place where this, and we're now going to another level, and I don't want to protract the conversation, but the tax system itself, the IRS codes, the way government supposedly, allegedly is financed, although in my research, I don't believe government was financed at all by taxes. I believe it's a payout to a global monetary cabal. Is it time that we begin to look at all of this from a different standpoint and formulate new strategies to move outside of the federal structure?
Right before this interview, I was reading a 1956 review of the initiatives that led to the current Small Business Administration, Randy, and what I will guarantee you is another hour conversation about the implications of the tax code and exactly why the tax system is where we need to understand both the pieces that are moving, and we need to understand where we as a people need to shift our behavior so that we do not continue to see the efforts that we engage in harvested by people who actually set a system up to do nothing but be parasites.
Well, I hope we get to have that conversation at a future date, David, because it's certainly big, and it's a conversation that we are beginning to engage with this show on a big scale right now. But I want to thank you for coming on, for taking time out of your travel today to talk with us and to kind of give us your take on global BEM and what's coming in the near future with energy and finances. And so thanks again for coming on today, David.
Always a pleasure, Randy. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
This is Our Planet Radio.